Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to US Modernist Radio. Join George Smart and Frank King as they talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. Show your support by visiting US Modernist's massive archives at usmodernist.org. And now, the guys training currently for the 2018 Pritzker Prize without remotely having any of the qualifications, George Smart and Frank King.
Yeah. Hey, I'm Frank King, and where do we apply for that? Can we do a write-in campaign? Is that possible?
You may have to.
Support for US Modernist Radio comes from, wait for it, the angelic Sarah Sonk of Mod Homes Realty. She's a lovely, virtuous, intelligent single lady who loves LL Cool J, yoga at sunrise, avocado toast, who doesn't, and late night visits to the Waffle House. Yeah, like it's open any other time of day. Yeah. Wait a minute. That's her Plenty of Fish profile. Sarah Sonk is actually a real estate agent. Oh, I'm sorry.
It says in the contract every time we say her name, the angels sing.
Sing. Is a real estate agent who gets modern like you do. She's totally into it and has the expertise, experience, and track record to close your deal. You can find her at modhomesrealty.com or 919-601-7339.
Thank you, Frank. Architect Edward Durell Stone was born in Arkansas. While studying at MIT, he won a fellowship to Europe, and like many of his generation, he fell in love with modernism. He returned to New York and worked on such projects as the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, Rockefeller Center, and Radio City Music Hall. His first independent commission was a 1933 modernist house for Richard Mandel, which led to many other prominent commissions, including the Museum of Modern Art in New York and the Kennedy Center in Washington. Stone is one of the few architects to make the cover of Time magazine, which he did in 1958. Also that year, he appeared on the TV show What's My Line? I had hoped this was on YouTube, but it's not, sorry to say, although Frank Lloyd Wright's episode is. Business Week calls Stone the man with $1 billion on the drawing board for the number and scale of prestigious projects in development. About that time, however, Stone had a change in philosophy about modernist design and moved away from what he called the transient enthusiasms of modernism. Stone was not alone. By 1970, the modernist movement was nearly dead. But here in North Carolina, Stone worked with Raleigh architects John Holloway and Ralph Reeves on two of the state's most recognized and treasured buildings, the 1963 North Carolina Legislative Building, and 20 years later, the North Carolina Museum of Art. Our guests today are Stone's son, Hicks Stone, and Reeves' son, Bernie Reeves. Hicks Stone grew up in New York City and is the author of Edward Durell Stone, a son's untold story of a legendary architect. As a boy, he got to see the great buildings in Greece, Rome, and Britain. His father rented one of Palladio's villas outside of Venice, where they stayed for a year. And later, Hicks pursued career interest in marine biology and law, but like many architects' sons, he eventually followed his DNA back to design. Hicks is now the principal of Stone Architecture and has been featured in House and Garden, Palm Beach Cottages and Gardens, The New Yorker, and This Old House. Welcome, Hicks.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Heralded publisher and political writer Bernie Reeves was born in Raleigh and graduated from UNC Chapel Hill. His father was Ralph Reeves, who, with partner John Holloway, worked with Edward Durell Stone on the North Carolina Legislative Building and the North Carolina Museum of Art. Bernie went on to start Spectator magazine, the first city weekly arts newspaper in the South in 1978. He started Triangle Business Journal, the first business weekly in North Carolina in 1984, Triad Business Journal in 1986, and Raleigh Metro magazine in 1999. In 2003, he created the top intelligence gathering for the lay public, the Raleigh Spy Conference, to address the mounting flow of declassified information available since the end of the Cold War. Along the way, He won the Benjamin Fine Award for Education Writing, ran for Congress in 2010, writes for the National Review, and has been a good friend to our website since we started. It's his usual charming self, Bernie Reeves. Welcome, Bernie.
I'm delighted to be here, especially with Hicks way up there in Connecticut, right, Hicks?
Yeah, no, you're really accomplished, Bernie. I had no idea. I'm very impressed.
Oh, thank you. I hoped you would be. Good job, George.
Thank you. I only read half of your bio, so there's much more accomplishment. Well, Bernie, you and Hicks got to know each other when Hicks' book on his father came out, right? Or was it earlier than that, Bernie?
I think that's about right. Hicks needed to find out.
That's how we met. Yeah,
the building in
I think
Raleigh.
we actually formally met when I came down there to give a talk at that very prominent bookstore.
Quail Ridge.
Yep, exactly. And we both took a tour of the state legislative building, which was a great thrill for me.
It was great for Hicks because he had never seen the building. And we're such an obscure place. It's almost like, do you have Buckminster Fuller's famous poem with you?
You know, I wish I did. You know, George, I think you've got it on your website.
Yes, we do.
I'm pretty sure you do. Yeah.
It's a nice compliment at the end and the green hills of wherever it was. Yeah, very nice.
But, it's a great poem. Someone else who actually took classes with Fuller at Southern Illinois University just asked me for that poem. I've got to try and find it from my files. Either that, or I'll just copy and paste it from George's website. You don't?
No, not at all. People steal from us constantly. That's what we're there for.
Of course. But Hicks and I got along immediately, and we had that in common about our fathers, but he had never seen the legislative building. It really wasn't on his radar for his book because we're so obscure, so that's where we were. And I think Hicks was decently impressed with it. I love that building.
No, you know, I really was. I think what's remarkable about the building for me is the way the public and private circulation paths are separated. And they really never intersect. I don't know what they've done subsequently, but of course the legislators come in the basement and they go to their private offices that are ringed by those that ring those four corner atrium, and the public comes in the main floor and goes up the stairs, the formal stairs, and looks down from the galleries on the legislators. So it was really a clever way of splitting the users of the building.
Well, first of all, just don't forget that's the first legislative building in the country. And nobody had tried that yet, separating it from their capitals. We did that. And I understand that the staircase represents public access.
That's right.
The public can always go up into the chambers or look down on the chambers.
That's right.
It has that big red carpet out there that they won't let anybody walk on.
That's right.
I think it's been there since 1963.
Probably.
Well, you know, it wouldn't surprise me. That was one of my dad's signature colors. I think really from his earliest days on Radio City Music Hall, which uses that red.
Well, it's amazing that building is so old and looks so new and young and fresh. I mean, it's amazing to me how it's kept its integrity for so long.
And the legislative building has recently been remodeled, put a new roof on it, and landscaping and some internal features. It looks excellent.
Well, I'm glad to hear it.
Hicks, your father and Frank Lloyd Wright were quite close. It was one of the few deeper friendships Wright had with any prominent architects. How did that develop?
Well, in 1940, Dad took a automobile trip across the country, and he stopped in at Taliesin East in Wisconsin, and he met Wright and said that he was overwhelmed by the beauty of the architecture. And really, from that moment forward, you can see either explicitly or subtly the impact of Wright's work on Dad's work, and you can actually even see it on the state legislative building. So that's how they first met, and the relationship continued over the years. My parents and I would visit Taliesin West in Arizona. I, in fact, mopped the kitchen floors in Taliesin West because everybody whose last name wasn't Wright was required to do some work.
That on your resume?
I guess it should be.
Yeah.
How old were you, Hicks?
Oh, I probably was maybe 10 years old. It would have been after Wright died. My mother and Dad would continue to visit Taliesin and Mrs. Wright, Olga Ivana, even after Wright's death in 1959.
Hicks, what changed for your dad in moving away from modernism in the 60s? What were some of the universal values he began to embrace?
Well, I think you could see it starting in his U.S. Embassy in New Delhi. It was a shift from modernism that has subsequently been termed New Formalism. But the tenets of modernism were described in Philip Johnson and Henry Russell Hitchcock's book, The International Style. And in that, typically buildings were devoid of ornament. They were asymmetrical. And if you look at Dad's New Delhi embassy, he reintroduced ornament in the form of a ornamental screen wall, and he placed the building on a podium symmetrically as one would find in ancient temples, Roman temples, Greek temples. So those, I think, were the two critical shifts in Dad's practice away from the fundamental tenets of modernism, symmetry and ornament.
You certainly see that in our legislative building. It's much more
You do.
with ornament and symmetry than some of his earlier residences, for example.
Which says off the academic community and architecture who'd been on Hicks's father for years for not doing exactly what they wanted. Right, Hicks?
You mean like Henry Kamphoffner?
Yes, I do. I was getting to
that. That's a very good story.
Yes, we'll get to that.
But I'm gonna let Bernie tell that one.
Yeah, I'm gonna tell it. Well, I'll tell it later.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hicks, how did your father and Bernie's father come to work together on the legislative building? What was Edward Durell Stone connection to North Carolina?
You know, Bernie, did your dad contact my dad to kind of do the job jointly?
Yeah, that's the way I understand it.
How the evolution worked.
I think my father was at the Brussels World Fair, where your dad had done the exposition, and I think he then got in touch and said, look, we've got an interesting project in North Carolina. It's not as big as you'd ordinarily see, but it's unique. And they got together and had a pretty good time doing it, built it on time, under budget.
Whoa.
How about that?
That never happened.
That's good.
Yeah, that happened back then. In case you're wondering, I remember what I was going to say about time-wise. I understand that he's got a separate sinking fund for taking care of the legislative building outside of state property. So they get all caught up into the politics of whether we do the ag building or the county building. You know, it's got its own, what's the right word?
Pile of cash.
Pile of cash.
That'll work. Fund.
That'll work. That'll work.
Yeah, no problem. There's some bags of green somewhere.
Yeah, somewhere.
So, Bernie, your father invited Stone to participate in all of this.
Yeah.
And then how did it grow from there? What's the rest of the story?
Oh, my God. As Hicks knows, that's complicated. While Hicks's dad is fighting in the national stage about architecture and the academics attacking architecture they didn't like, had a mini copy down here with the dean of the School of Design at State, who immediately went after Stone for not being, de rigueur. So that's part of what began it all. But they withstood all that. But the biggest culprit in all this stuff with my father and Ed Stone is the News and Observer. The daily newspaper here purposely tried to destroy not only the legislative building, but really went after the Museum of Art to the point that they lost most of their funding, and what they ended up building was 1/3 the original because of the News and Observer. So it was very charged with politics all the time. So a lot of anecdotes about that, but yeah.
Yeah, we'll talk about the museum in a minute, but it should be noted that the museum is much more of a modernist structure than the legislative building. How did that shift?
Yeah. Well, I have to kind of reveal something that may be a little bit of a disappointment. I don't think Dad had much much of a role in the museum. I believe the date was 1971 that the museum was completed.
No, 82.
82, 83, it was finally built. It was designed much earlier.
Okay. Well, that would explain it, of course, because Dad had died in 1978. He'd retired from practice in 74. But for the 2 or 3 years before his retirement, he had not been aging well. Dad smoked 3 packs of cigarettes a day. He was totally averse to any sort of exercise, had the worst diet of any human being that you possibly could encounter.
Was he one of those that treated bacon as a food group?
Well, absolutely. I'll tell you a funny story. There was always a stick of butter on the table in a kind of a very nice, presentation, nice dish. And every once in a while, Dad would just dig his knife into that stick of butter and put a pat of it right on his tongue.
Wow, he
was a hardcore consumer of that.
I think there's a TLC show for that on cable.
One thing that I want to say is sort of sideways about your dad. I met him once or twice when he was down here in the Legislative Building.
Oh, you did?
Yeah, and one of the things I noticed about him is that other great men I've met, he's got this huge presence. He does. He's tall, and you can't help but think of the Fountainhead. He fits the thing perfectly, and I think people should know that.
He was a very imposing figure, but everyone always described him as charming and gracious and very easy to get along with. I think that's one of the reasons he was so successful, is because people enjoyed his company so much.
Good point.
But in any case, I mean, just circling back, when the 70s came around, Dad was not in great shape, and most of the design work of the office at that point was deferred to a couple of junior partners. And one of them in particular had a predisposition towards what we call brutalism, and I think it was that partner, a wonderful man and an excellent designer named Gary Vowles, who probably was a significant contributor to the North Carolina Museum of Art. So,
well, that building was delayed 7 years before they could get it built, and that's so whatever they originally designed was deteriorated by then. Having to cut it in thirds. So
I know Bernie has in his kitchen, I guess, a beautiful rendering of the original design for the entire Museum of Art campus, which has water features and multiple buildings.
Mostly the wings. You can see the wings on the side that are not there now. And I will say something.
I don't know if I ever saw that. Yeah.
Well, this is a bit flattering, Hicks. Larry Wheeler, a friend of mine, director of the Museum of Art, has pushed for an expansion of the art museum. They have a new building out there. And so the architects were talking about what to do with the old building, and Larry Wheeler thought they would just tear it down. And they said, oh, no, that's an Edward Durell Stone building. Oh, there's a change. There's this big sea change going on. And I think your book and that little anecdote together with many more are important.
Yeah, that's great to hear.
Good.
In North Carolina, the Legislative Building was a huge success. The public really loved it.
Oh, yeah.
School children by the thousands would be bussed in from all 100 counties to go walk through it. But there was constant criticism from the modernist Henry Kemphefner, who was dean of the School of Design at NC State. He openly criticized Stone and Holloway and Reeves in the News and Observer and spoke out regularly against the designs and, in the museum's case, the location of the buildings. I understand this was a painful experience for your dads.
Well, what happened is that the big deal became we need to put it downtown because they want the downtown to grow. But the commission looked around the world for ideas and were told everywhere they went, do not build in an urban area because you can only go up. You would have 8 floors of parking and 10 floors of art. That's it. And so they went ahead with it, and everybody agreed with it. But then a cadre in the legislature started working, undermining that decision, and they then ended up being sued somewhere along in there, where they had sued the Council of State. Then They made a big deal out of the downtown. And now, of course, the people who were against downtown, like the Daniels family, that was the News and Observer, they stand up at Art Society meetings. Aren't we fortunate to have a place? Weren't our architects visionary to do this? And it's the most right word, contradictory thing you've ever heard. But yeah, there was a lot. They put my father in his grave.
Really?
Oh my God, yeah. Especially when they took the side of a crooked contractor. Ralph, my father, went out on the site and told him to leave. It was that bad. And it had to do with the masonry, which has been the problem from the beginning.
The brick exterior?
Yeah, that was supposed to be done by a subcontractor, and the construction company instead used its own casual labor. Didn't use the brick expert, and so it was a big mess.
Well, Camp Hefner and Stone were knowledgeable of each other for quite a long time, and were not on great terms, I understand.
Yeah, I'm not really sure what the rationale is, but I know that Camp Hefner's article in the News and Observer really upset Dad. It upset him to such a degree that he actually wrote the executive director of the AIA inquiring whether Camp Hefner had violated the Code of Professional Ethics of the AIA. So that's uncharacteristic for Dad to do. He normally was not a confrontational person, so he must have been very hurt by what the article said.
That's a great example of how highly charged all this has been. I mean,
yes.
It's really been that way politically.
I'm not really sure. Honestly, the building does not strike me. I mean, it's a wonderful building. It obviously, the workings of it are remarkably clever, the way public and private circulation are separated. But in terms of kind of a strong rhetorical statement that's anti-modernist, I don't really see it that way. So, I mean, Dad did much stronger rhetorical buildings that were in opposition to modernism, and I can think of a number of them just off the top of my head. But this wouldn't have been one of them, in my view. So it almost makes me feel that there was some personal issue involved here.
Well, clearly there was. There are lots of apocryphal stories about Camp Hefner and Stone getting in one zinger after another for each other. And the most widely circulated one, Frank has for us.
Yes, Camp Hefner scholar David Brooke wrote in his dissertation, and this is a quote, according to a widely circulated story, often told by Camp Hefner himself, he and Stone had a run-in at an apartment party in New York City in the 50s, hosted by Henry Haskell, editor of Architectural Record. Stone was 5 years older than Camp Hefner and was described by interviewers as a big and formal, handsome man who was soft of speech and had a habitual expression of kindness. Yet that evening in the 50s, Stone spotted Henry Camp Hefner and declared, "Well, what do you know? Henry Camp Hefner's here. You know, there are three things in this world that are overrated: architecture, f***ing, and Henry Camp Hefner." There was dead silence, and then Haskell turned to Camp Hefner and dryly said, "Well, Henry, you're in pretty good company," and everybody burst out laughing.
Do you know if that story is true, Hicks?
Well, I've heard a slight variation on it, and architecture was not one of the three. It was home cooking. And Henry Camp Hefner. I have heard that story. I don't know if it's true, but I have heard it for sure. Yeah.
I tried to track down this morning. I was on the lead of someone who was actually at that party in 1959, but I haven't returned my call yet. So on the website later, we'll try to get some verification on the story.
Yeah.
I'll have to. I spent time in the Douglas Haskell papers at Columbia University, and I'll see if I have anything in my notes about that.
Yeah. But here you go. I mean,
if I do, I'll pass it on.
But it just shows you how, again, politically charged it was here. Legislative building, then the art museum. This doesn't happen in Des Moines, Iowa. It doesn't happen anywhere but in Raleigh. I'm telling you right now.
Yeah, the Corn Palace wasn't that controversial. So.
Yeah, that's right. The big barn.
The Corn Palace.
Which reminds me, the only structure that Camp Hefner designed was the band shell in Iowa, I think it was, and his home in Raleigh, which was unsaleable because of the way he designed it. People couldn't live there. So that's all I got to say.
What doesn't add up to me is Camp Hefner was known as a disciple of Frank Lloyd Wright. And in one sense, so was Dad. Dad was a huge promoter of Frank Lloyd Wright. So they actually had something very important in common. And why that didn't bridge, that common interest didn't bridge this personal gap is unclear to me.
I assume something had to happen with the newspaper contacting him and asking him to criticize the building. I don't know that for sure. When he called it Four Seasons West and all that kind of stuff, they could have done it on purpose.
The way I've heard it is that Camp Hefner and NC State was upset about the fact that this commission for their state capital was largely going to an architect from out of state, even though Holloway and Reeves were a Raleigh firm and were going to be supervising much of the work and running it through. There was some professional jealousy there.
Oh, yeah.
That kind of parochial jealousy, resentment is very common when you're a national architect, because I've seen instances of it in other projects that Dad did. So I think you probably hit the nail on the head.
And let's remember, it's not the state capitol; it's the legislative building.
Legislative building.
Yes.
We kept our capital. Which was a wonderful. I mean, North Carolinians shows us taste sometimes. We want to save our old capital and then have a place where the legislature can meet, and not try to junk the old capitol up with the wings coming out, the offices for legislators. That's a big deal to me.
Well, and Sherman spared the capital, so I think we should let it stand.
He did indeed.
Hicks, you've written that you and your dad had, and I quote, a tenuous and at times difficult relationship. What caused that?
Well, my parents had a problematic divorce, and as a young boy, I was close to my mom, and when Dad leaves, and you're living at home with your mother, it's probably somewhat natural that you start to villainize him for kind of the failed marriage, failed family, and that's pretty much what happened. But over time, you understand as you mature that relationships aren't black and white; they're gray. And when a marriage fails, it's usually not one person's fault; it's both people's fault. And I realized that, and over time, I just began to understand Dad's point of view much more clearly. Throughout that period, I always was aware of this kind of unfair drumbeat against Dad's work.
Right.
And I think that combined with my renewed appreciation of him as a father impelled me to write this book. So
it's important for history. But speaking of problematical, I mean, you were telling me you were in your first survey kind of course in architecture at Yale, right?
Oh, yeah.
And tell them what happened.
It was at Harvard Graduate School of Design, and my first year survey of modern architecture.
Right.
And this, mind you, is at the height of the postmodern movement, when every student designer is doing like these historicizing buildings in the fashion of people like Michael Graves and Robert Stern and those kinds of things.
Venturi.
Yeah, exactly. They flash a picture of Dad's New Delhi embassy up on the slide presentation. And this is a class of 80-some students. They all start hissing.
Oh,
wow. Oh, yeah.
For me, more than anything, that drove home the irrational aspect of the critical fury that had been directed at Dad. Because here was a room full of historicizing architects who were in fact hissing probably the first historicizing architect of the 1950s. In fact, the person who'd made what they were doing, and Robert Stern and Michael Graves were doing, possible. Dad was really a proto-postmodernist, and here it was a class full of postmodernists. It made no sense, and it just showed how shallow all of the kind of critical vituperation was that surrounded.
Well, did you keep up with the New Yorker, Tom Wolfe and the New Yorker? I think it was. Tom Wolfe, the novelist. He came to.
Oh, sure.
He tried to save the Arts and Crafts building downtown that your father designed.
Yeah, the Museum of Art for Huntington, Hartford.
That's okay.
Yeah, he was very active in that. He was.
And they were trying to tear it down, and Tom Wolfe, of all people, came on his side.
There was a good group of people in support of the building, but ultimately it wasn't demolished. It was just the facade was essentially stripped from it, and it was clad in a very modern, austere fashion. Yeah. So
Hicks, I understand the motivation to write your book 30 plus years after your dad's death was something we've just been talking about. Was that your father had been treated unfairly by the architectural community?
Yeah, exactly. He had been treated unfairly, and still is, really. A lot of the older critics and architects have died off, but the lessons that they gave to the next generation still linger.
Well, as I say,
experience it.
Down here in Raleigh, we're a microcosm of what was happening to your dad. My father was under the same kind of pressure all the time, unfair and totally untrue, and really had a financial effect on him.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Well, that's true, though. I mean, you're public architect, it's tough.
Well, Bernie, most people in North Carolina don't realize how prolific your dad and John Holloway were. Their list of well-known buildings is pretty extensive. You've got the Fairgrounds Livestock Barn, the Highway Building, the Revenue Building, about 8 buildings at UNC hospitals. You've got sections of Dorothea Dix, the Catholic Diocese, dozens of churches, Hale High School, North Carolina State University, Harrelson Hall, Polk Hall, the Alumni Building, all of Ravenscroft, St. Augustine's, St. Mary's, Sanderson, Fred Smith, Blue Ridge Road High School, and the list just goes on and on.
That's everything but the Krispy Kreme store.
Just about. Plus, they were the architects of record for a lot of First Union banks and almost all the Southern Bell properties in the eastern part of North Carolina.
East of Charlotte.
It's incredible.
Yeah, it is incredible. Wow. So have a career like that and then have that nasty newspaper take a vengeance on my father because he was in the way of the chairman of the building commission.
I see.
All politics down here, Hicks, all politics. And vicious.
How come you didn't become an architect, Bernie?
People say that, and I didn't like cross-hatching in the summer, but but I will say that I find myself using the DNA from that in my publishing business because a magazine has to be designed. It has to. You can't put the bathroom on the front porch. You can't put a bed, that kind of thing. And so you
can in certain towns,
right? But you start being an architect of, and it took people a while to understand why I wanted things a certain way. So yes, I do it that way.
So Hicks, you have a sister, and I think you also had a couple of half sisters too, as well.
Dad was married three times. He had 2 children, my 2 older brothers from his first wife. I have a sister from Dad's marriage to my mom. And then late in his life, Dad married his beautiful and charming personal assistant, naturally. And they had a daughter together, Fiona, who probably of all my siblings I'm closest to.
And has she shown interest in architecture and design?
She is. She's actually taking, I think she stayed out of school for a while, and now she's back in, and she is taking a degree in architectural engineering at a college in New Jersey. So
cool.
My eldest brother, who died a number of years ago, was the founder and chairman of a very large land planning firm in Florida called Edward Durell Stone Jr. and Associates, and they planned most of the important resorts in the Caribbean basin, and that firm still exists today.
Wow.
And they do terrific work. And the other two siblings, they were smart and stayed away from architecture.
Like me, huh?
Hicks, do clients seek you out to do updates on your dad's buildings?
They have, but I wish more of them would, honestly.
Well, good. If you're listening, clients, then we'll hook you up.
Yeah, exactly.
Right here.
Dad did a beautiful 5-story condominium building in Palm Beach, Florida. Has a central atrium with a reflecting pool and planters, kinds of the things you'd see in the state legislative building. And they very kindly contacted me to do a renovation and restoration of that building. It was actually, I believe, the second condominium in the state of Florida. So it was kind of history-making in a way. And then I did a renovation of my family townhouse on East 64th Street, which was a very controversial project when Dad did it in 1956. That's the one that is, you may have it on your website, George. I'm pretty sure you do. That's the one with the ornamental screen wall,
yes,
which is on 64th Street between Park and Lex. And I think I've probably done some other work, though it's not immediately springing to mind. I'd need my wife here to remind me. She knows my project list better than I do, I think.
My wife's here, too, just in case. Believe me.
In 1962, your dad gave this quote, which clearly he is kind of over modernism by this point. He said, another current fad in these individual dwellings, which I decry, is a so-called ranch house. This rage for informality in American life, I believe, is a lame excuse for laziness. It's obviously easier to feed the children hamburgers in the backyard in the manner of ranch hands from a chuck wagon than it is to have them sit at a table where they might conceivably acquire some dignity, manners, and grace.
Woo! How about that?
You know, that sounds like something Dad would say, and honestly, I can't say I disagree with him. I think, the loss of the formal seated dinner and the art of conversation, which Bernie has such a wonderful grasp of, is probably lost on the people who don't sit at a dining table and enjoy the formality of a meal. Maybe I'm just being a little stuffy, but
well, I'm glad we're past the time where Frank and I grew up, where we had those TV dinners and the foil pouches that you would heat up and put on your special TV tray.
Yeah, sure.
That was all the rage about 1971.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And TV decided where people eat in front of Jeopardy.
There you go.
Hey, nothing wrong with that.
I love Jeopardy.
So, Hicks, I want to thank you and Bernie both for being on the show. We really loved having you here. It's a real special treat.
No, it's my pleasure. Always delightful to talk about Dad, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to do so.
And thank you for including me.
You bet, Bernie.
Good talking to you, Hicks. We'll catch up soon.
I look forward to it.
Yeah, me too. You and I.
Hey, thanks for listening to US Modernist Radio, which is underwritten by... Tom, we finally got it right. Sarah Salk, the real estate agent who loves modernist houses just as much as you do. 919-601-7339. Have you done radio, Tom?
Yes. Have you?
Yes. Okay, Tom, take us out.
Visit USModernist.org for more information about today's guests. US Modernist Radio is produced at Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song was performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl. US Modernist Radio is a production of North Carolina Modernist Houses, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guild. George and Frank and I will be back in 2 weeks for another award-winning edition of US Modernist Radio. That is, once we win something. Can podcasts even win that Pritzker Prize?
I don't know. We'll find out.